The early morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's Main Street as Harold Thompson carefully locked the front door of his small white house. At 93 years old, his movements were slow but purposeful. He adjusted his worn Navy veteran cap, which had become as much a part of his daily outfit as the clothes he wore. The golden sunlight caught the single medal pinned to his beige jacket, a Purple Heart from his service in World War II. Harold's wooden cane made a gentle tapping sound against the concrete sidewalk as he began his daily four-block journey to Pete's Diner. He had been making this same walk every morning for the past 37 years, ever since his dear wife Martha passed away. The diner had become his second home, a place where he could find both good food and friendly faces. The morning air was crisp, and Harold could see his breath forming small clouds as he walked. He passed by Mrs. Anderson's flower shop, where bright yellow daffodils were just starting to bloom in the window boxes. She waved at him through the glass as she arranged her morning display, and Harold lifted his cane slightly in response, their daily morning greeting that had not changed in decades. At the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, Harold paused to rest. His old bones weren't as strong as they used to be, but he refused to give up his morning walk. A young mother pushing a stroller smiled at him, and Harold reached into his pocket, where he always kept a few wrapped candies. He offered one to the young child, just as he did with all the children he met on his walks. The mother knew Harold well. Everyone in Millbrook did, and thanked him for his kindness. As Harold continued his journey, his mind wandered to the old days. He remembered when Millbrook was just a small collection of buildings, when the grand oak tree in the town square was merely a sapling, and when Pete's Diner was first built by Pete Sr. back in 1946. Harold had been one of the diner's first customers, fresh from the Pacific theater of war, still adjusting to civilian life. The sound of birds chirping brought him back to the present. Harold noticed how the town was slowly waking up. Mr. Jenkins was opening his hardware store, the newspaper boy was making his rounds on his bicycle, and the smell of fresh bread was drifting from the bakery. These simple morning routines gave Harold comfort. They were constant, reliable, like the ticking of a well-made clock. Finally, Harold could see Pete's Diner ahead. The red and white awning fluttered gently in the morning breeze, and the neon OPN sign glowed warmly in the window. Young Pete, who wasn't really young anymore at 60, was already waiting at the door. He held it open as Harold approached, just as he did every morning. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," Pete said with genuine warmth in his voice. "Your usual table is waiting." Harold's usual table was the third booth from the door, where he could see both the street outside and the entire diner inside. The vinyl seats were worn smooth from years of use, and the morning sun streamed through the window, warming the spot perfectly. Sally, the waitress who had been working at Pete's for over 20 years, already had his coffee poured and waiting, black with 1 sugar, just the way he liked it. As Harold settled into his seat, he looked around the diner with content. The chrome and red decor hadn't changed much since the 1950s, and that's exactly how he liked it. The walls were covered with old photographs of Millbrook and its residents, including one of Harold himself from 1946, standing proudly in his military uniform next to Pete Sr. on the diner's opening day. Sally brought over his usual breakfast order without him having to ask: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and a side of crispy bacon. Harold unfolded his paper napkin and placed it carefully on his lap, just as Martha had taught him to do all those years ago. This was his morning ritual, his piece of paradise in a world that sometimes moved too fast for his liking. Little did Harold know that this peaceful morning routine, which had remained unchanged for so many years, was about to face an unexpected disruption that would change everything. The peaceful atmosphere of Main Street changed one Tuesday morning in early spring. Harold was making his usual walk to Pete's Diner when he first heard them, the loud rumble of motorcycle engines that seemed to shake the very ground beneath his feet. 5 large motorcycles pulled into the empty parking lot next to Pete's Diner, their chrome parts gleaming in the morning sun. The riders were dressed in black leather jackets with patches and logos that Harold couldn't quite make out. Their leader, a tall man with a thick beard and tattoos covering his arms, switched off his engine but left his bright headlight pointing directly at the diner's windows. The other riders followed his example, creating a row of harsh lights that disrupted the gentle morning sunshine Harold had come to love. Inside Pete's Diner, the regular customers watched with concern as Harold made his way past the bikers. Sally, who was serving coffee near the window, frowned as she noticed one of the riders deliberately stretch his legs out, forcing Harold to step off the sidewalk into the gravel to get around him. The biker laughed, nudging his friend who was sitting on his motorcycle nearby. "Look at the old-timer," the second biker said loudly, making sure Harold could hear. "Bet he's never seen real bikes like these before." Harold kept his eyes forward and his grip tight on his cane. He had seen plenty of motorcycles in his life, but he kept this knowledge to himself. As he reached for the diner's door, the roar of another motorcycle engine made him jump slightly, causing more laughter from the group. Pete watched this scene unfold from behind his counter, his face growing red with anger. He started to move toward the door, but Harold gave him a small shake of his head as he entered. "Leave it be, Pete," Harold said quietly as he made his way to his usual booth. "They're just young men showing off." But the peace of Harold's morning routine was broken. The bikers made the parking lot their new meeting spot, arriving each morning just as Harold would begin his walk. They would rev their engines unnecessarily, filling the air with noise and exhaust fumes. Sometimes they would race their bikes up and down the street, the sound echoing off the buildings like thunder. Mrs. Anderson stopped putting her flowers outside, afraid they would get knocked over. The young mother with the stroller started taking a different route to avoid the commotion. Even the birds that used to sing in the trees seemed to have found a quieter place to spend their mornings. One morning, Harold noticed that his regular table was occupied by two of the bikers. They had spread themselves across the booth, their leather jackets creaking against the vinyl seats that Harold had sat in for so many years. Sally approached him with an apologetic look, leading him to a small table near the kitchen instead. "Your usual breakfast, Mr. Thompson?" she asked, trying to make the best of the situation. "Yes, please, Sally," Harold replied, his voice steady despite the disappointment in his eyes. From his new seat, he could hear the bikers laughing and talking loudly about their latest rides and road trips. Pete tried his best to help. He put up a reserved sign on Harold's regular booth, but the bikers would just move it aside or sit there anyway. They would order only coffee and take up space for hours, leaving small tips and making messes that Sally had to clean up. The worst part for Harold wasn't the noise or even losing his regular seat. It was watching his beloved morning routine change into something he no longer recognized. The peaceful start to his day had become a test of patience and dignity. Other regular customers started coming in later or finding different places for breakfast, not wanting to deal with the rowdy group. As Harold sat at his small table near the kitchen, sipping his coffee that didn't taste quite the same anymore, he thought about how quickly things could change. The diner that had been his sanctuary for nearly 4 decades was becoming a place he almost dreaded visiting. But Harold Thompson wasn't a man who gave up easily. He had faced worse situations in his life, though none of his fellow breakfast patrons knew just how much worse those situations had been. 3 weeks had passed since the bikers first arrived at Pete's Diner, and things were getting worse. The morning air, which used to smell like fresh coffee and bacon, now carried the strong scent of motorcycle exhaust and cigarette smoke. Harold still made his daily walk, but his steps were more cautious now, his ears alert for the sound of approaching motorcycles. The bikers had learned Harold's schedule and seemed to take special pleasure in making his morning difficult. They would time their arrivals just as he reached the middle of his walk, roaring past him so close that the wind from their bikes would ruffle his jacket. Harold's hand would shake slightly on his cane, but he never showed fear on his face. One particularly cold morning, Harold noticed something different. The bikers had parked their motorcycles in a new way, forming a tight line across the sidewalk. There was barely enough space for anyone to squeeze through, and certainly not enough room for an elderly man with a cane. Harold stood there for a moment, looking at the blocked path. "Something wrong, old-timer?" called out the leader, who was leaning against his bike and drinking from a silver flask. "Sidewalk's a bit crowded today, isn't it?" The other bikers snickered, watching to see what Harold would do. Harold looked at the street beside him. It had rained the night before, and water was still flowing in the gutter. To walk around the bikes, you would have to step into the wet street, risking both his balance and his shoes. But Harold had faced worse obstacles in his life, so he carefully began to make his way around the motorcycles. As he passed the second bike, one of the riders suddenly kicked out his leg, catching Harold's cane. The wooden stick clattered to the ground, sliding under one of the motorcycles. Harold stumbled but managed to catch himself on a nearby parking meter. His shoulder ached from the sudden movement. "Oops," said the biker with a fake apology in his voice. "Didn't see that there. Maybe you should watch where you're going." Inside the diner, Pete had been watching through the window. He burst out the front door, his face red with anger. "That's enough," he shouted, rushing to help Harold. "I'm calling the police." "No, Pete," Harold said firmly, straightening himself up. "Don't call anyone." His voice was calm, but there was a steel in it that made everyone, even the bikers, pause for a moment. One of the younger bikers, perhaps feeling a touch of shame, reached under the motorcycle and retrieved Harold's cane. He held it out, but as Harold reached for it, the leader snatched it away. "Nice stick you got here," the leader said, turning the cane in his hands. "Probably worth something to someone who collects old junk." Sally had come outside now too, along with several regular customers. They formed a small group behind Pete, who was still fuming. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "That cane," Harold said quietly, "was given to me by my late wife, Martha. I would appreciate having it back." The leader smirked and held the cane out, but when Harold reached for it, he pulled it back again. "Maybe we could work something out," he said. "How about you find somewhere else to eat breakfast? This place is getting a bit too crowded anyway." Harold stood there, looking at his cane in the biker's hands. His blue eyes, which had seen war and peace, love and loss, hardened slightly. For a brief moment, something flickered across his face, not fear, not anger, but something else. It was the look of a man who had seen far worse than a group of bullying bikers. Pete stepped forward again, but Harold raised his hand to stop him. The morning sun caught the purple heart pin on Harold's jacket, making it gleam. A few of the bikers noticed it for the first time, and their smirks faltered slightly. "Young man," Harold said, his voice carrying clearly across the parking lot, "you seem to be under the impression that you're dealing with just a helpless old man." He paused, straightening his veteran's cap. "I think it's time I told you a story about who I really am." The leader's grin began to fade as he noticed the change in Harold's demeanor. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to learn why it's unwise to judge a book by its cover, especially when that book had survived one of the biggest wars in history. The autumn morning was colder than usual as the small crowd gathered in front of Pete's diner. The air felt heavy with tension as Harold stood facing the biker leader who still held his cane. Steam rose from the coffee cups of the customers who had come outside to watch, their breakfasts forgotten on their tables inside. The leader twirled Harold's cane like a baton, trying to look casual, but something about Harold's calm demeanor made him uncomfortable. The other bikers moved closer to their leader, forming a loose circle around Harold. Their leather jackets creaked as they moved, and the chains on their boots jingled against the pavement. "A story?" the leader said, trying to sound amused. "We don't have time for bedtime stories, old man, but I'll make you a deal. If you can take this cane from my hands, you can keep coming here. If not, you find somewhere else for your morning coffee." Sally gasped from where she stood near the diner's door. Pete took another step forward, but Harold's steady gaze kept him from interfering. The regular customers whispered among themselves, worried about what might happen next. "Before I take back my cane," Harold said calmly, "let me ask you something. That patch on your jacket, the one with the skull and wings, where did that design come from?" The leader looked down at his jacket, surprised by the question. "This is the Death Ravens patch. We're the toughest motorcycle club in 3 states. He puffed out his chest proudly. "Been around for 5 years now." Harold nodded slowly. 5 years. I see." His voice carried a hint of something that made the leader's smile fade slightly. "And that motorcycle you're sitting on, that's a Harley-Davidson Softail, isn't it? Nice bike, probably cost you quite a bit." The leader frowned, confused by Harold's knowledge of motorcycles. "What's your point, old-timer?" "My point," Harold said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "is that you boys think you know everything about bikes and brotherhood." He pulled out an old, worn leather wallet. "But sometimes the oldest trees have the deepest roots." The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the parking lot. A cold breeze rustled through the trees, making the younger bikers pull their jackets tighter. But Harold stood straight and tall, despite not having his cane. "You wanted to make a deal about my cane." Harold's voice grew stronger. "Well, I have a better idea. Why don't I tell you about the time I rode from California to New York on a 1940 Indian Scout? Or maybe about the motorcycle club I started after the war, the one that helped veterans find their way back to normal life. The leader's hand, still holding the cane, dropped slightly. "You're making this up," he said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Am I?" Harold asked. He opened his wallet and carefully removed an old photograph. "Take a look at this, young man, but be careful with it. It's one of the few things I have left from those days." The leader stepped forward, curious to spike himself. The other bikers moved closer too, trying to see what Harold was holding. The photograph was old and creased, but the image was clear enough. A young man in a leather jacket, sitting proudly on a gleaming motorcycle, surrounded by other riders. The young man's face was unmistakably Harold's, just 50 years younger. But it wasn't just the young Harold that caught the leader's attention. It was the patch visible on his jacket in the photograph, a design that made the leader's face turn pale. His hands began to shake slightly, causing Harold's cane to tremble in his grip. "That's impossible," the leader whispered, his eyes wide. "That patch. I know that patch." Harold's eyes met the leader's, and for the first time that morning, he smiled. "I think it's time you learned about the real history of motorcycle clubs in this town," he said. "And why that patch you're so surprised to see has a very special connection to your own family." The leader's grip on the cane loosened as he stared at the photograph, his tough guy facade crumbling in the face of a revelation he never saw coming. The other bikers gathered closer, their expressions changing from mockery to amazement as they began to understand that they had severely underestimated the old veteran standing before them. The morning crowd at Pete's Diner watched in silence as Harold slowly took his cane back from the biker leader's trembling hands. Nobody moved as Harold pointed to the patch in the old photograph, a majestic blue devil riding a motorcycle through flames. "The Blue Devils Motorcycle Club," Harold said, his voice clear and strong. "Founded in 1946, right here in Millbrook. We started with just 7 members, all of us fresh from the Pacific Theater. We had seen enough violence in the war, so we decided our club would stand for something different: brotherhood, honor, and helping others." The leader's face had lost all its color. His hands reached up to touch a silver chain around his neck, pulling out a pendant that had been hidden under his shirt. It was the same Blue Devil design, but in metal instead of cloth. "This was my father's," the leader said quietly. "He told me stories about the Blue Devils when I was a kid, said they were legendary, the most respected motorcycle club in the state's history." Harold nodded, carefully putting the photograph on a nearby table. The morning sun caught the Purple Heart pin on his jacket again, making it shine. "Your father? What's his name?" "Jack Martinez," the leader replied. "He passed away 3 years ago." A warm smile spread across Harold's weathered face. "Little Jackie Martinez. Of course, I see the resemblance now. Your father was one of our youngest members. He joined in 1965, right after I taught him how to ride." The other bikers had gathered closer, their earlier hostility completely forgotten. One of them carefully picked up the photograph for a better look. "Wait," he said, "you're telling me you're Hurricane Harold, the founder of the Blue Devils?" Harold chuckled softly. "Nobody's called me Hurricane Harold in a long time, but yes, that was my nickname back then. You see, during the war, I served on a destroyer in the Pacific. We rode out 3 typhoons, and I was the only one who could keep his feet steady on deck. The name stuck when I started riding motorcycles." The leader, Jack Martinez's son, suddenly looked ashamed. "My dad used to tell me about Hurricane Harold. He said you were the one who gave him a chance when nobody else would. You taught him to ride, got him his first job at the motorcycle repair shop." "Your father was a good man," Harold said, leaning slightly on his cane. "He had a wild spirit but a kind heart. He became one of our most trusted members." Sally appeared from the diner with a fresh cup of coffee for Harold. As she handed it to him, she noticed tears in the leader's eyes. "Dad kept every photo, every piece of Blue Devil's history," the leader said, his voice thick with emotion. "He had this old leather jacket he never wore, but always kept perfectly polished. It had your club's patch on it. When he was sick, he made me promise to keep the jacket safe." Harold took a sip of his coffee. The Blue Devils weren't just about motorcycles. We were about respect, about helping veterans find their way home after the war. We raised money for families in need, organized rides for charity. Your father understood that better than most." The leader suddenly dropped to one knee in front of Harold, head bowed. I'm sorry, he said, his voice cracking. If I had known, Dad would be so ashamed of how I've been acting. The other bikers followed their leader's example, showing respect to the man they had been mocking just minutes before. The customers watching from the diner's windows could hardly believe what they were seeing. Stand up, son, Harold said gently. Your father wouldn't want you on your knees. He'd want you to stand tall and remember what the Brotherhood of Riders really means. As the bikers stood, the morning sun seemed brighter somehow. The leader wiped his eyes and looked at Harold with newfound respect. Would you? Would you tell us more about the Blue Devils? About my dad? Harold smiled, gesturing toward the diner. Why don't we all go inside? Pete makes the best coffee in town, and I've got plenty of stories to share. He paused, looking at each of the young riders. Stories about real brotherhood, about honor, and about a time when the rumble of motorcycles meant help was on the way, not trouble. Inside Pete's diner, the usual morning crowd watched in amazement as Harold sat in his regular booth, now surrounded by the same bikers who had been tormenting him just minutes before. The leader, whose name was Thomas Martinez, sat closest to Harold, hanging on every word the old veteran spoke. Pete himself brought over a fresh pot of coffee and enough cups for everyone. The smell of coffee mixed with the leather from the bikers' jackets, creating a strange but comfortable atmosphere. Sally quickly took orders for breakfast, smiling at the unexpected turn of events. Here, Thomas said, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out his phone and showed Harold a photo of an old leather jacket displayed in a glass case. This is Dad's Blue Devil's jacket. I built this display case myself after he passed. Harold adjusted his glasses to look at the phone screen. A smile crossed his face as he recognized the jacket. I remember the day we gave Jack that jacket. It was 1967, after he completed his first charity run. We raised money for the Children's Hospital that year. The other bikers leaned in closer as Harold pulled out more photographs from his wallet. Each picture told a story of the Blue Devils' golden years. There were images of motorcycle rallies, charity events, and group rides through the mountains. Your father, Harold said to Thomas, pointing to a photo of a young man with a wide smile, was our best mechanic. He could fix any bike that came his way. That's why we put him in charge of maintaining our entire fleet when we started our motorcycle safety courses for returning veterans. Thomas wiped his eyes again. He never told me about the safety courses. Oh yes, Harold continued, accepting a refill of coffee from Pete. Back then, many veterans came home troubled. Some had seen things in Vietnam that haunted them. We found that teaching them to ride, giving them a sense of brotherhood, it helped them heal. Your father had a special way with the most troubled ones. One of the younger bikers raised his hand slightly, like a schoolboy. Sir, is it true that the Blue Devils once rode across 3 states to help a stranded family? Harold chuckled. Christmas Eve, 1968, a family's car broke down on their way to visit their dying grandmother. No mechanics were open, so we organized a relay, 15 riders, 3 states, taking turns escorting that family to their destination. They made it just in time. The diner had grown quiet as everyone listened to Harold's stories. Even the regular customers had moved closer to hear better. Pete stood behind the counter, grinning as he watched his diner transform into a gathering place for healing old wounds. Thomas suddenly stood up and walked outside. He returned a moment later carrying something covered in a clean shop rag. I keep this in my bike's saddlebag, he said, carefully unwrapping the item. It was an old, metal Blue Devil's badge, polished to a perfect shine. Dad gave me this before he died, Thomas explained, his voice soft. He said it was given to him by the founder of the Blue Devils. By you, sir. He told me to keep it safe until I understood what it really meant. Harold took the badge in his hands, running his fingers over the familiar design. I remember giving this to Jack. It was a symbol of trust, of brotherhood. He earned it by always stopping to help others, even when it wasn't convenient. Looking around at the young bikers, Harold saw something change in their eyes. The tough guy act was gone, replaced by genuine respect and interest. They weren't just listening to stories about motorcycles. They were learning about honor, about helping others, about being part of something bigger than themselves. You know, Harold said, handing the badge back to Thomas, the Blue Devils may not exist as a club anymore, but their spirit, what they stood for, that can live on through riders like you. Thomas looked at his fellow bikers, then back at Harold. Would you? Would you be willing to teach us? Share more stories. Show us what real brotherhood means. Harold's eyes twinkled as he reached for his coffee cup. Well, I still come here every morning at 7, and this booth is plenty big enough for those who want to learn about the old ways of riding with honor. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, illuminating the small group as they sat together, the gap between generations bridged by a shared love of motorcycles and a newfound understanding of true brotherhood. Over the next few weeks, Pete's diner saw a remarkable change. Each morning at 7 o'clock sharp, Harold would arrive to find Thomas and his fellow riders already there, their motorcycles neatly parked in a row instead of scattered across the lot. They would stand up when Harold approached, pulling out his chair and making sure his coffee was ready just the way he liked it. The morning air no longer filled with the aggressive roar of engines. Instead, the bikers learned to idle their motorcycles quietly, respecting the peace of the early hour. Mrs. Anderson's flowers returned to their window boxes, and the young mother with the stroller resumed her regular route, often stopping to chat with the bikers who now held the door open for her. Thomas had taken to carrying a small notebook, writing down everything Harold shared about motorcycle maintenance and riding techniques. The other riders teased him at first, but soon they all had notebooks of their own. Harold's stories weren't just about motorcycles anymore. They were lessons about life, respect, and community. You see, Harold explained one morning, spreading out some old photographs on the table, the Blue Devils had a code. First rule was never pass a stranded rider. Second was respect everyone, not just other bikers. Your father lived by these rules, Thomas. Savvy noticed that the bikers had started leaving larger tips and cleaning up their own tables. They would bring in fresh flowers for the diner every few days, and helped Pete fix the wobbly tables that had been unstable for years. The regular customers, who had once avoided the bikers, now greeted them by name. One morning, Thomas arrived at the diner earlier than usual, looking excited. "Mr. Thompson," he said, using the respectful name he now always used for Harold, "we found something amazing in my dad's old storage unit. Would you come outside for a moment?" Harold followed Thomas to the parking lot, where the other riders stood around something covered with a tarp. With a flourish, they pulled the tarp away to reveal a dusty but intact 1940 Indian Scout motorcycle, the exact same model from Harold's old photograph. "It's not running," Thomas explained, "but we thought, maybe you could teach us how to restore it. Dad always said you were the best mechanic he ever knew." Harold's hands trembled slightly as he touched the old motorcycle's handlebars. Memories flooded back, the wind in his face, the open road ahead, the brotherhood of riders who had become his family after the war. "Boys," he said softly, "I think it's time I showed you what real motorcycle maintenance looks like." The transformation wasn't just in the bikers' behavior. The whole town began to notice changes. The Death Ravens patch on their jackets was now accompanied by a smaller Blue Devils pin, given to them by Harold from his personal collection. They started organizing charity rides, just like the original Blue Devils had done. Their first event raised money for the local veterans' home. Pete had to add more tables to accommodate the morning crowds. People came not just for breakfast now, but to listen to Harold's stories and watch as he taught the young riders about motorcycle history and maintenance. The diner became a place where old riders would stop by to share their own tales, creating a bridge between generations of motorcyclists. One morning, as Harold walked toward the diner, he heard a familiar sound, motorcycles approaching. But now, instead of feeling tension, he smiled. Thomas and his friends pulled up alongside him, their engines quietly purring. "Your escort awaits, Mr. Thompson," Thomas said with a grin, gesturing to their bikes lined up like an honor guard. Harold looked at the young men who had once tried to chase him away. Now they sat tall on their motorcycles, respect and admiration clear in their eyes. The morning sun caught their Blue Devils pins, making them shine like badges of honor. "Well," Harold said, adjusting his veteran's cap, "I suppose even an old-timer like me could use a proper motorcycle escort now and then." The riders beamed with pride as they slowly rode beside Harold, guarding his walk to the diner. From her flower shop, Mrs. Anderson waved, and the young mother with the stroller smiled as she passed. The morning air filled not with the harsh roar of rebellion, but with the gentle rumble of respect, a sound that reminded Harold of the brotherhood he had helped create so many years ago. 6 months had passed since the day Harold first revealed his true identity to Thomas and his fellow riders. Spring had turned to summer, and summer was now becoming fall. The restored 1940 Indian Scout motorcycle sat proudly in front of Pete's diner, gleaming in the morning sun. It had taken 3 months of weekends, countless hours of work, and many of Harold's old maintenance lessons to bring the classic bike back to life. Today was special. It was Harold's 94th birthday. As he made his way toward the diner, he could see something different. The parking lot was full of motorcycles, not just Thomas's group, but riders from all over the state. A banner hung across the diner's front window reading, "Happy Birthday, Hurricane Harold." Thomas stepped forward from the crowd of riders. He was wearing a newly cleaned leather jacket with both the Death Ravens and Blue Devils patches displayed proudly. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet morning air, "we have a birthday surprise for you." The crowd parted to reveal the restored Indian Scout, now decorated with a large bow. Next to it stood Pate, holding Harold's old leather riding jacket that Thomas had carefully restored from his father's collection. "We knew you always wanted to ride one last time," Thomas said, helping Harold into the familiar leather jacket. "We checked everything 3 times. She's running perfectly, just like you taught us. And we'll all be riding with you, your honor guard." Harold ran his hand along the motorcycle's seat, feeling the perfectly restored leather. The handlebar grips had been rewrapped exactly the way he had shown them, using the same techniques he'd developed back in 1946. His eyes grew misty as he remembered all the miles he'd covered on a bike just like this. "The doctor says I'm too old to ride," Harold said softly, but his eyes never left the motorcycle. "That's why we got it all planned out," Thomas explained. "The police chief has closed off Main Street for 1 hour. We've got riders in front and behind. Pete's nephew, who's a paramedic, will follow in his car. It's just 6 blocks, nice and slow, with all of us watching out for you." The gathered crowd began to chant softly, "Hurricane Harold, Hurricane Harold." With help from Thomas and 2 other riders, Harold carefully mounted the motorcycle. His hands found the grips naturally, as if the decades away from riding had never happened. The familiar feel of the bike beneath him brought back a flood of memories: rescue rides, charity runs, teaching young riders like Jack Martinez the right way to handle a motorcycle. "Remember what you taught us," Thomas said, starting the bike for Harold. "Nice and easy, respect the machine, and she'll respect you back." The Indian Scout's engine purred to life, sound perfect thanks to the careful restoration. Harold felt the vibration through the seat and handlebars, a sensation he thought he'd never experience again. Slowly, carefully, he gave the bike a little gas. More than 50 motorcycles roared to life around him as riders from across 3 generations formed up to escort Harold on his birthday ride. Young riders who had learned from those who had learned from him. Old riders who remembered the Blue Devils in their prime. Even Pete came out of the diner, tears in his eyes, to watch. As Harold began to move forward, the memories of every ride he'd ever taken seemed to flow through him. The wind on his face felt exactly the same as it had in 1946. Thomas rode just ahead, carefully watching their speed, while other riders formed a protective circle around them. For 6 blocks, Harold Thompson wasn't a 94-year-old man who needed a cane to walk. He was Hurricane Harold again, founder of the Blue Devils, mentor to generations of riders, keeper of the old ways of motorcycle brotherhood. The small crowd that had gathered along Main Street cheered as he passed. When they finally returned to Pete's diner, Harold's hands were steady as he switched off the engine. His eyes were bright, and his smile was wider than anyone had seen in years. Thomas and the others helped him off the bike, but Harold stood tall, straight, and proud. "Thank you, boys," he said, looking at each rider in turn. "You've given an old man more than just a birthday gift. You've shown me that everything we built, everything we believed in, will live on through you." As they all headed into the diner for birthday breakfast, Harold took one last look at the Indian Scout. In its chrome surface, you can see the reflection of the past and the future, young riders learning the old ways, carrying forward the spirit of brotherhood that he had helped create so many years ago.